everyone. My name is Steve Zalewski. I am the former CISO of Levi Strauss. And I want to thank Kathy for the introduction. Today, I have the distinct pleasure to be able to talk to Rob Aragao from OpenText, and we're going to have a conversation around digital DNA and the convergence of data and identity. So I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Rob, why don't you introduce yourself? Take a couple of minutes, give us a sense of, your past, where you came from, and what it is that made this such a passionate topic for us to talk about today.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that, Steve. Looking forward to our conversation for sure. So again, Rob Aragao. I've been in cybersecurity for over 25 years now. My current role is as Chief Security Strategist with OpenText. Prior, I've run different organizations from a cyber perspective at managed security service providers within the telecom industry, within the manufacturing industry, part of HP and part of their security organization there as well. So it goes back over many, many years of different verticals and being the customer and now being the vendor in transition, which has been interesting. The passion behind this topic, Steve, really drives at the factor of many conversations that I've been having, say, over the past maybe year, even year and a half, really stems around we discussed identity and identity security and identity access management, and then we have a separate conversations around data security, data privacy, and a lot of the missed intersection points and collaborative opportunities that we're not engaged in within an organization is becoming a bigger problem as we continue to move forward to adoption for cloud, AI, all the different kinds of elements that are really calling out a need for us to think differently and how we approach the convergence really of the security of our data elements and the identity interactions to get to that data overall. So that's really the key aspect of kind of why I wanted to promote more of this topic in our conversation here today.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. So let me start with a couple of questions, and I just want you to speak about it from your perspective, right? Why is this problem? And they go, so for 30 years, we've had private data centers, right? And we've had virtual private clouds, and we use a network service edge, that I call it, to be able to protect access to our data. What's changed, right? Don't we still have that capability to use a network service edge? What has the cloud done that's caused us to have to leverage a different type of architecture?
Yeah, it's a great question because it really gets to the stem of the problem. And it's about, can we still use that today? Sure, we can still use it today, but the problem statement is shifted for us. And if you go back to, even pre-COVID, we were making the shift to the cloud. Many organizations, and that basically became accelerated during the cloud time. But yes, we used to be able to look at it from here, our different core systems, applications that are sitting within the perimeter, that we have full capability of proper protection mechanisms and schemes around them. Firewalling, as you mentioned, VPN, other elements. And then how do we manage those identities and interactions to and through the business applications to the data? The problem now, as we look at it, where does most of the data reside? Up in cloud environments. How are we accessing back through these different workloads through the different CSPs that we're engaged with? So this completely changed our approach and almost kind of flipped it on its head as to the way we used to try to deal with the identities and the interactions and support of how they were engaging with access controls into the data on-prem versus now, really the identity has shifted to almost kind of be centered and wrapped around the data, not just as a whole in a database, but even the fields or data elements specifically that one should be able to have access to, be authorized, verified, and validated that they actually have the rights and the purpose behind why they're even able to engage and leverage and access that data. So we have to really start thinking completely differently in the approach. Again, almost kind of a backwards model, if you will, that shifted for us, where this is centered around the identity taking on a life of its own, literally to become a new interface through APIs, through other mechanisms, as being a non-human identity aspect of the problem we're now put in front of dealing with.
Interesting. Okay. So this concept of workload identity that you just introduced. But before we dive into a little bit more, I want to probe a little deeper on what you said, which was, so we have structured and unstructured data. We've had it for 30 years, and we've had it in our data centers. So are you telling me this is just a scale problem, that what we're doing is just putting it in the cloud and replicating it more often? Or are we creating new classes of data? It's like, help me understand, is it just we've now gotten outside of the box, so to speak, and so we're sprawling the data, or are we doing something with the data that's different than sprawl, that there's more of it?
Yeah, so that's a great question and a great phrase you just used there, a word, sprawl, right? Data sprawl. It's absolutely a major core component of the issue we're now dealing with. We have data everywhere. So we still have that mix sitting on-prem. We have that mix of sitting up again in different cloud environments. So it's not a singular issue. It is an issue of many organizations working with, initially one of the cloud services providers, and then realizing that there's other needs and requirements they have in front of them that maybe they should actually go and leverage a different CSP for. And so now, okay, maybe that same set of data used by different applications will now be also in that other environment. And then you have now the introduction of cloud data warehouses, yes, through some of the CSPs out there, but also vendors that are only focused in the CDW space, right? Cloud data warehousing space. So now what? Shifting and moving even more of that data. And one of the major issues there, Steve, is also the aspect of not just sprawl, but also volume and scale, as you actually also called out. That is part of the problem. Right? We're seeing, again, the issues we had in the past of data analytics. And the idea is, hey, organizationally, we want to be able to monetize the data. And therefore, what are we going to do? We're going to just pump all this information, all this data into these different repositories, different locations for our people to be able to go through and analyze and try to drive some insights that identify opportunities for our organization to have additional streams of revenue, new intelligence in our customers that we can work with. So all these different outcomes from a business sense come into play. All great, all needed, important. But the factor now is, again, this scale and volume of data continues to amplify itself. In the age now we are dealing with of actually true AI use, not AI being introduced, because that's been there for many, many years, as you know, but the usage of, hey, we're pumping even more information and data out there for our teams to be using. Well, then where does it exist? And what data is sitting out there that has actual sensitive information that we have to account for? So that becomes a whole new factor we have to take into account.
Okay. So I want to now talk about structured versus unstructured, because you brought that up. And I want to make sure I understand this, which was,
Mhm.
we've had structured data in databases, SQL databases, you pick. Okay.
Yeah.
And those databases characterize the data, right? They have a schema, so we can try to do classification. Are you telling me that while we're still doing that, unstructured data is becoming a larger and emerging problem that we have to handle? Or is it structured and unstructured data both are equally increasing in volume in the sprawl in the cloud? Which
Yeah,
way?
it's a great question, and it's actually both. It is both. It's yes, there's quite high volumes of unstructured data that honestly have not really been truly accounted for, and it's been lacking in sometimes capabilities of being able to understand, where unstructured data resides. That is something that we need to take into account with sensitive information sitting within it. But honestly, the structured data problem continues to exacerbate itself, right? Because it's even more volume again of information that's flowing out there and being populated into these different data repositories. So I don't look at it as one being the issue. I feel that we just have to center it around data as a whole. And that data is unstructured, structured, in some cases, semi-structured data. So how do we look at dealing with data as a whole, no matter what kind of data that is, no matter where the data actually exists, and how do we help drive towards solving those types of problems to get our arms wrapped around the reality of what sits within that type of structured, unstructured, or semi-structured data that we have to take accountability for and understand how to properly protect. Is it something that still needs to actually be used and leveraged within these different applications or not? So getting our arms really wrapped around that is another aspect of what we have to deal with, because it's majorly become an issue that is simply just continued to amplify with all the different use cases that we're seeing out there.
Okay. So given that situation, and again, I'm looking at the history, which was if I'm trying to find the data, right? So I need visibility, and then I got to characterize the classification of the data. Right? We've had this concept of DLP, right? Data loss prevention, which means data characterization. And then we have DSPM, which has been introduced, which was from a cloud perspective. In essence, how do I go find the data to classify it? It would seem to me after 30 years of figuring out how to classify data that all this is a scale problem. We just have more of it. But for 30 years, we've been solving the problem. So is there something different about this, or have we actually not solved the problem? And what does that mean for us?
Yeah, so I am, again, in my opinion, majorly focused on we still have a major problem out there to solve. It has not been solved. Right. So I don't care if one looks at it from the perspective of, my environment is simply stated that I am within my own managed data center. I control everything. I don't really push something in the cloud. I control everything. And therefore, I can have a real clear understanding of what my information is, the data elements behind it, and the usage behind it, and the reasons behind it. I've not come across one single organization that can honestly answer that question. Do you really know where all your sensitive data resides? Even if it's someone that literally still contain everything in that box, if you will. So again, the problem has absolutely pushed back out to a much greater scale. Yes, with the opportunities that the cloud presents us, right? And we want to take advantage of that, push it out there. Well, let's take it a step back, Steve. So why is it to me not only that this is a new bigger problem? It's really the old problem has become that much more of, again, a major issue to contend with. It comes down to the simple aspect of looking at it from a people, process, technology based approach. And what I mean by that is there's too many times you go into an organization and you're mapping out and understanding kind of how the business is laid out and trying to understand what they deem the sensitive data elements are for them. And so what I'm getting at is before we can even apply technology, right, it's the people and process aspect that comes into play first and foremost. And if you don't get that right, forget about technology. So the people aspect of it and the process starts with having the conversations with each of the different line of business owners, right? So I can give you an example of an organization in the financial services that we've worked with. They have 7 different lines of business. And each of the stakeholders for the line of business, for each of those lines of businesses, we had mutual conversations to sit down and say, here's what we're looking to accomplish. We have these issues that relate to sensitive data that you may have within your line of business that could become an issue for the organization holistically, not just from maybe a regulatory, privacy issue penalty associated to it, but bigger ramifications around what does it mean if we've got a data breach and the brand, the market share, all of the negative business outcomes we want to stay away from. And so when you frame it and understanding of why we're doing this, now you have a better conversation. And they're really focused on helping you solve the problem mutually. And that drives us, Steve, at much more of, okay, let us give you some examples of what we mean by sensitive data. Right, so that could be, again, within their line of business. It could be their own intellectual property, secret recipes, depending on the line of business, right? It could be, again, in this financial service organization, people information, their consumer information, right? The social security number, any sort of unique identifiers and things of that nature, right? That is deemed sensitive information. But you have to give them the examples so they can kind of have the aha moment and go, oh, I see what you're saying. Here are the things that I'm thinking about likely are going to be sensitive data elements. And as we go through those things, now you have to come to, again, mutual agreement of, well, then how do you want to classify them, right? And typically you kind of structure it in 3 different buckets and you decide what criticality levels and naming conventions you want to apply to them. But you agree across the board that this is the type of classification model that makes sense for your organization. And at that point in time, now you're able to start thinking about how you can apply technology to help solve identification on a continuous, to your point, it's this ongoing cycle, continuous visibility of where does the sensitive data actually exist, no matter where it resides, no matter what kind of data it is, that gets us moving in the right direction. So I'll kind of pause there, but that's the basis of having those engaged conversations to paint the picture of what's possible, to get the detailed information that you need to support really driving towards actually applying supporting solutions that allow you to have more of a understanding of really where that data resides.
Yep. Well spoken. So let's talk about how we do that for a minute, right? Which was from my experience as a practitioner. What
Mhm.
we generally are doing are having humans accessing business applications, and the business applications are accessing the data. And I'm using role-based access controls to be able to do the authorization, the entitlement management. So I know that Rob, when he logs into the HR system, right, is allowed to see his personal data, but nobody else, right? And so the business application sees all the data, but I use the entitlements for the business application to be able to limit what the human can see. Is that still the primary way that we are accessing this new sprawl of data in the cloud? Or are you seeing different use cases that this traditional method of solving the problem has reached its limits?
Yeah, so another great question. So, yes, the humans are still obviously interacting to get access to data in certain applications, but there's been a major shift also in that point of how actually the business applications gain access into the appropriate data. And that is for more of the non-human type of identity factor. APIs is a great example of that. Right? Even other things like IoT devices, another example of that. But really the business application interface, the data is very heavily driven by APIs. They're looking to make those calls in to pull specific data elements back out to service back to whatever the request was of the application or the end user's question, if you will. So it's a great call up, Steve, that we need to understand that the problems that we dealt with and have continuously dealt with from identity access management specific to humans, which we're still trying to deal with and solve for, has really needed a major rethinking of how we start driving towards dealing with these non-human identities, because that's the majority again of interfacing with the data going forward, and getting our arms wrapped around that is yet another issue that we're trying to contend with at this point.
It's interesting you introduce non-human identities, which in the last year has gained popularity as a term.
Mhm.
And yet we also use the word workload. So
All right.
in your mind, is there a difference between non-human identity and workload identity?
For me, again, I kind of lump them into the same category. I do. I don't think I just look at it really as again what we've historically been used to in the past from a human identity perspective, and the non-human identities really are all sorts of things. And yes, workload is an aspect of it, but APIs are really what hooks behind the scenes for all of those different workloads to function at the end of the day. And as I mentioned, other things that fall in that bucket for me again are things like IoT devices that we're seeing a huge expansion of, and the need for how they're engaging with data flows and how they're needing to protect the data flows that are coming back and forth from those calls to the applications for sensors and things of that nature as well.
Okay. So again, relying on my experience, right? When I look at the app dev, application development, right? And we look at these non-human identities, I traditionally think about service accounts, privileged access management, and that what I've got are these service accounts that have no identity. They're associated not to Rob or not to Steve, but they're just administrative service accounts that I have to use to be able to do configuration or access certain information. And I used privileged access management and vaulting of those secrets to then be able to simply leverage access to those secrets right? Either to an individual or within code to be able to access whatever data I need. Is this fundamentally different, or what we're talking about is simply just a larger volume use case for privileged access management of administrative accounts?
So when you look at it from kind of that level, it's the same problem. It's really just multiplied itself. But the question is, are the privileged access management solutions able to deal with that type of volume? Are they able to deal with those different types of kind of intricacies of how the application that was calling the particular identity or the factors to authenticate back in properly, right? So there are adjustments that have been made and continue to need to be made on the privileged access management front to really deal with that size and scale more than anything else. And some of, again, those differences that we're now seeing are introduced by the need for the API calls there within, again, the code as well, right? And aspects of that. Now, let me kind of take another step further with, since you brought up the topic of privileged access management. Another key aspect of that, back to the app dev teams, is that's a great use case of really where secrets management, privileged access management comes into service. Again, a very key use case. The other aspect that needs to be thought about is again, the app dev team having that access is again a true privilege, and you need to also think about how do we account for what these developers are actually doing once they've gained the access into the environments. And do we have mechanisms in place to be able to understand what's appropriate use and not appropriate use? And we can do that through different capabilities around monitoring the behavioral patterns of what they're doing when they're interfacing with the code repositories, as an example. And are we seeing some things that seem to be a bit off, and we can flag them? That's another area we have to take into account now. And that's an area because, as we've been talking about identities being a major factor in, in security breaches now, to get to the data, the applications are right there with it, right? Over 80% of application vulnerabilities are exploited to ultimately obviously get into the data side. So you have to take into account, can we watch and monitor for these developers and what they're doing within the code repositories effectively for access rights? Yes, but also what are they doing? And are they doing something that may actually flag something that we can get ahead of, see that the change that they've made is actually inappropriate, and then go back in and model it back to be something that protects us and ultimately access into the data from some sort of security issue down the line. That's another aspect we have to start kind of extending privilege access into as part of another use case, if you will.
Okay. So when we talk about access, let's talk about that for a minute, which is there's authentication and authorization, right? So authentication is, do I have the right to the data, right? And authorization is it appropriate for me to be accessing the data? Okay. And that's the difference between entitlements, right? Authorization, authentication. So in your mind here, is this an authentication problem we're having with the, identity convergence with data? Or is it an authorization challenge that we're having, which is it's not that we trust you with the data, but we're trying to figure out what is an appropriate use of the data in a contextual near real-time format?
Yeah, I go with the latter on that. And I do it more so from, you've probably heard also purpose-based access control. And I call it out specifically because when you look at, for example, many of the different regulation out there centered around privacy, GDPR, stateside, all the different regulations that we have in place and coming, it's all driven behind what's the purpose that you actually have this data, for example, on a consumer. This is an example, right? And so when you think of it that way, from that privacy aspect and requirement that you have to also answer to, that helps you center that focal point around the data and saying, okay, what's first the purpose that we even have this data, and should we continue to? Once we've defined and come to agreement that the purpose is relevant for our business operations and our needs and what we're trying to accomplish, then you flip it to the other side of it, as you were talking about, and the access and authorization aspects of it. So whatever the identity may be, the human, the non-human aspect coming back in, right? What's the purpose of them having the access now? And are they authorized to that data? When you link those three elements together, to me, that's kind of where you really have this. I'd love to say utopia, but it's not going to ever be a perfect world. But still, it's as close as you're going to get at this point in time to having the right level of access for the right people to the right set of data and data elements explicitly for what their needs and the purpose of their needs are. So I think there's a key linkage, Steve, in my point of view, that ties this together from access, authorization, but ultimately also to, again, the purpose behind why and tied back at the core of the data.
Got it. Now, this conversation, if we take it up a step, right, is identity and access management is about identity lifecycle management, right? It's about the establishment of identity, the birth of an identity, right? Giving it birthright entitlements, and then managing it through its life cycle as it gets new responsibilities and gets removed from old responsibilities and eventually is deleted. This is just classic life cycle management. And we've been doing this for 30 years with human identity, right? Or trying to, and leveraging this conversation. So, are you telling me that this is a fundamental problem that are just our larger IAM programs just need to extend into workforce or non-human identities? Or is this a set of new work that we're having to do in conjunction with our traditional IAM lifecycle management?
Yeah, so my answer to that would be simply that it's a combination of the two. I think we still have the issues in front of us with, in essence, identity lifecycle management or identity governance as a whole. And what I mean by that is you still see many, many organizations that are doing these things manually in spreadsheets, tracking through, you know, Steve's new role is XYZ, and therefore we have to obviously pull away those entitlements and shift to these new entitlements and continue to do that on an ongoing basis. And if you're doing that manually, we know that introduces many different issues potentially for concern afterward. So how do we take that into a more automated, continuous model, right? And the continuous kind of identity governance aspect is we have a way to be able to understand, that based off of triggers within our HR systems, Steve's role has changed. And therefore, here's the effective change in the details of role shift. So we're going to peel this automatically back. We're going to add this into the equation for Steve to be successful in getting in essence, almost like onboarded again, right? But it's that provisioning, deprovisioning aspect that's just baked into an automated system, right? Now, the combination factor that I mentioned, why do I say it's a combination? Because to your point, the workloads, right? All these different aspects that we've been discussing about, how do we actually now truly more so engage with the business application to get to the data? Non-human APIs. That's really, again, the key. And if we think about, we're still dealing with this problem typically over here on the human side, we have minimal visibility on what the APIs actually are that we're using, right? And managing those APIs and the interactions and the purpose behind their use, right? Their roles and responsibilities, are they changing? Have we decommissioned that API or not, right? All these different variables come into play that still provide the potential for us to have out there as a security concern going forward. And that's the size and scope of the problem expanding itself. So if you're not able to, or haven't yet, really gotten your arms wrapped around the human aspect of it all, right? The issue really has become even that much more of a multiplier as we're now moving and pivoting towards dealing with the non-human identity factor in all of this.
Okay. So I'm going to pivot again. So thank you for bearing with me as I put you through the ringer. Um, and there is this challenge for all of us with SaaS vendors and third-party risk management, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Which is we've been talking about when the data is within our control, right? And it's our data and we're moving it into the cloud. The challenges we have with workload identity, the explosion, to your point, of APIs now being the actual identity that has to have entitlements because we're doing API to API exchange. We're not doing human to business application exchange. And that fundamentally, I think, is what you've been calling out is that transition in how we do business, in the exchanging of data, in the establishment, right, propagation of data in the cloud, is calling out this workforce identity. So we've got challenges trying to handle that within our own ecosystem. Talk to me about third-party risk management, right? And what that means to a CISO who's now trying to leverage SaaS vendors and this propagation of API-based data exchange.
Yeah, so it's a major issue, obviously, as we talk about third party, fourth party in many cases now as well. Um, so, you know, it's difficult because you have to be able to have some sort of way of measuring and having obviously the trust factors in place with the third parties that you're dealing with. And a lot of that does come into play with obviously, initial setting up through validation and security questionnaires and, that they're doing as a vendor, the things that you need to ensure they're abiding by for their own security mechanisms, controls, and program overall, relative to, your data being mapped in and through their SaaS-based offerings. So a lot of that though still, I think it goes back to we've always discussed, when we're dealing with, the shift to the cloud and we're going to sign up with pick a, cloud service provider, the whole shared responsibilities model comes into play. In many cases, I think unfortunately people have thought about it as, well, yeah, it's a shared responsibility, but it's still they're more responsible for protecting our information and securing our information. So they are, but there's a reason why it's shared responsibility. You're still accountable at the end of the day. It's still your data at the end of the day. So being able to have some way to be able to measure and assess that the third parties you're working with, leveraging your data, are truly protecting that information effectively. All right. And so, there's different obviously capabilities out there and tooling to look at that environment. But at the end of the day, it really is still back on you to have a means of being able to actually secure the data. What I would say is one of the things that we've done in this particular area for a use case is we have looked at how we can actually hook into the different SaaS providers that are out there. So you think about a Salesforce or Workday as an example, where there's some pretty sensitive information flowing back and forth, and how we actually can sit in the middle, right, of the end customer organization to that SaaS provider as a data interceptor. So the calls, think of it almost as a proxy. So the data call going through is being reviewed to understand and assess what, if any, sensitive data actually is being communicated, pulled or pushed, right? Because we don't know if when we pushed it, if it actually isn't being protected, right? So that whole exchange. And then when and if we flag it as a sensitive data element, we can actually, at that point, inside of that proxy, if you will, in the model we take, protect it, meaning that we'll actually take whatever the data element is. Let's say social security number is an example. We'll take that, we'll keep the same format, but we're actually going to change off what the actual digits are. So it's not the real information, but the application doesn't need to be changed to support that, right? The end user making the call and the request and has the right role and responsibility and purpose to actually view the data, that role defines them actually having visibility to see the full social security number or just the last 4 digits or whatever their role is determined by policy to be. So my point, Steve, kind of long-winded, but the focus is for us in that third party kind of, concern with the SaaS provider example. That's how we've helped solve that concern and issue when we're dealing with it, looking at, again, the sensitivity of the data and how we're actually able to protect that communication between us and that provider.
Okay. In my simple view, again, this is Steve's view, it used to be, I say, the good old days, right? Which was, it was a human identity talking to a business application, and I was moving data. Well, I had control over the human identity. I had authentication and authorization, role-based access controls, and I knew the business application because for the most part, right, they were thick clients and thick applications, and I had good control. So therefore, I knew it was a trusted exchange between two trusted parties.
Mm-hmm.
And what I say now is, but when I'm doing API to API, I actually can only trust at most one half of that exchange because I should know half because I'm the one either asserting the information out to a third party or
Mhm.
I'm the one accepting the information from a third party. And now all of a sudden, even within my own data center, if you want, right, I can only trust half because it may be in the cloud, it may be my own data, but exposed through a line of business that may have a different risk posture than
Right.
mine, or the interpretation of the classification of the data may be gray. And so, therefore, how confident am I in making that exchange? And so, in my mind, it's like that's the fundamental shift of what we're talking about with workload identity. Okay. And this conversation of assigning the workload identity to all this data is the fact that the new model is I can only trust at most half of the two that are exchanging. And so therefore, how do I go to what I call contextual authorization? That I'm looking at more real-time view of the data that's moving because the business is mandating that I move it
Mhm.
against the likelihood, right, or the risk posture of how risky can I let that exchange be? Is that a fair characterization in your mind of what we're doing?
I think that's a great way to break it down. Yes, it's a good example of tie-in, but I think it's really driven by so the contextual aspect, absolutely. And I do think, one of the key callouts that you raised is also the risk posture. Right. So if you go back, as I was discussing the example of the financial service organization, 7 lines of business, there's a top level risk posture and acceptance of risk. There's individual 7 lines of business views as well. So obviously it's going to be kind of what does their world look like? What are they willing to take on for risk and make the decision based off of? And then at the top, right? Are they looking at it in the same principle, or are they actually driving that down a little bit deeper? So I do think that linkage of the two are really really important factors in all of this that drive again this major shift that we've been seeing out there.
There. All right. So I think we've done a pretty good job, right, of starting with what is the convergence of data and identity? What is the passion? What does identity and access management look like? What are the
Mhm.
workload identities? Is this a privileged access management problem or not? Is it a virtual private cloud versus, you know, the um, cloud as a service and where the data is and whether it's data sprawl and the challenges of establishing governance in that sprawl and establishing classification. So, what I'd like to do is let's kind of turn and talk about OpenText itself and what you do, right, as a responsibility to look at this problem and provide solutions. And we were talking about this not so much to help me as a CISO as it is to take responsibility for some of these problems that you will stand shoulder to shoulder with me, right, to protect us as a village against the common enemy. Now, let me take it by steps though, because we've talked to so much here, right, that I want to be able to let you kind of work through the problem. Okay. So the first one we talked about is the visibility of all of the data and the ability to classify it. So can you help me understand how you own that problem for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to give you a real world example. Uh, this is tied to a large pharmaceutical end customer of OpenText, who we started working with probably about 3.5 or 4 years ago, Steve. And from our solutions, we provide not only the data discovery and classification, but also a data security piece that really ties into our approach to how we deal with it from a lifecycle perspective. And at the time, that pharmaceutical was very focused on securing the data. And our teams went in and said, okay, well, here's a solution. And they tested everything out and met their needs and requirements. Voila. They decided they're going to go ahead and buy that solution. So on our side, our team's very happy. We said, but time out. Do you know what that data is that you need to protect? Do you know where that data resides? And they said, no, we don't really know all of those details right now, but we think we have a good start. And we're working with this SI, which we were aware of, to help us get through the selection of the data to then apply your solution that we're investing in to protect the data. And we said, well, that's fair, but the timeline for you to really get that done, and with the SI, it's probably going to be quite extensive. The right approach from our perspective would be, as much as our team would love to go and sell this solution on the security side, is really pivot your focus on the front half of the problem. And again, this goes back to the example I was talking about, even for that financial service organization, which is we needed to get in and give them guidance onto how to have these conversations to understand what the sensitive data is they should be looking for. What that led to is a very positive outcome. To your point, shoulder to shoulder. That's an example of our teams can go sell this stuff to you right now. Is it the right thing though? For you, if you think so, go right ahead. We're going to give you some guidance and perspective as to why we think it's this way. And by the way, this way, starting with the discovery and classification for our sales team, wasn't the greatest, right? Because it was a lesser cost, but it was the right thing to do because then it led to a successful start to their program where now they could go through, have those conversations, take away the findings of the conversations that they've agreed to. What are the elements that we're going to look for? When we find them, what are the classifications we're going to apply to them? You've mutually agreed with the business, this is what we're going to do. And now the technology came into play to do that discovery on an ongoing basis, no matter whether it's structured or unstructured data, right? No matter if it's on-prem or up in the cloud. We find it, we continuously go identify, and we classify it. And then we can have the rest of the conversation and evolve your program for success on what you decide for actions to take on that data.
Excellent. So let me pivot to the next one then, right? Which is, so now we talked about kind of visibility into the data, finding it, classifying it, right? So we get the right classification. Now let's talk about the identity and access management part, right? Which was the assignment of identity and the authentication authorization components to be able to know that you're releasing it with the right amount of risk now that it's classified. What does OpenText do to solve that problem for me?
Yeah, absolutely. So this goes back into what we kind of discussed a little earlier. So I'll just reframe it really, which is, so we will plug in to look at an identity from a human and non-human factor. To us, again, it's an identity. Like I mentioned, doesn't matter if it's structured or unstructured data, it's data. Same principle. It's an identity. We've had to evolve to obviously just look at it in that regard. Do we distinguish the two? Absolutely. You have to. But the real aspect of value is that being able to have the mechanisms over the top for proper identity governance and lifecycle management, that's where, to me, it all stems from. And that's where we've seen the most success in working with our customers, right? I will tell you, Steve, that we have a full identity access management stack of solutions. But if I'm going back to sit in the customer chair, as I did in the past, my first focus and investment is really going to be around the governance aspect. I need to understand from, again, as you mentioned, right, the provisioning and deprovisioning life cycle of the identity, the elements of the role changes of the identity. How do I extend that to the non-human side of it? Because that's where my biggest vulnerabilities will be coming in from, right? And so being able to get ourselves wrapped around and understanding holistically how we actually govern the entire life cycle of the identity is where my investment would be made. And that's where we've seen the best outcomes from organizations that really look at it from that regard, and then go plug in the other elements that they need, right? And then evolve to say, well, we also need to do something from privileged access management. Absolutely, because we have these particular, examples we discussed, right? Like the app dev team as a great use case. But really, that's the emphasis, because it does drive towards examples I was discussing before, which is there's still a lot of manual angles taken on this, where I still see so many people saying I'm doing it and tracking in these spreadsheets over here. Okay, right? The frequency is off. The manual aspect of presenting major issues for the organization is off. Do you even have a way to track really that in a spreadsheet for the APIs? Good luck, right? So again, extending this much more of that focus on this continuous based identity governance and lifecycle management is where we really see great successful identity shift in programs occurring at this point in time.
So I want to kind of summarize it or ask you to summarize in this way. As a CISO, okay, I used to worry about trying to prevent the attack. And then you come to the point when you realize no amount of prevention. I can't build the wall high enough that they don't eventually get in. Okay. Humans make mistakes, right? That's just the nature of the business. So when I look at a vendor like OpenText, I say, you have three responsibilities for me as a CISO. You have to be my first line of defense, prevent. You have to be my last line of defense, which is detect, contain. And you have to provide my evidence of defense so that I can manage my governance, risk, and compliance. If I were to state the requirements that way, as my first line of defense, my last line of defense, and my evidence of defense, how would you position the capabilities of OpenText to address those three requirements?
So those are three straight requirements that I would expect to hear from any organization, right? And I think the way we look at it is very simply, really we have to have a good understanding and overview of, again, what are those different elements within your environment that you define as being, for example, sensitive on the data side, right? First and foremost, put the proper boundaries in place around how you protect that data or attempt to continuously protect that data, let's say, because as you said, right, we know they're going to get in and there's still going to be potential issues to deal with. But from that regard is, the security controls being put in place in a way where we're actually protecting the data effectively to the point where even if the attacker gets in and gets to that data, they can't take it. They can take it, but they can't monetize the data because it's not the real set of data. So that's one of the big value points that we bring to the table is going and applying our protection schemes on the data. So it's still used by the users, the actual applications. But when and if it's getting into the wrong hands, it's not the actual data. That's a major issue, that we really are focused on solving for, and that's something that we do today. So I would look at it from that regard. And then the other thing I think comes back into that preservation of the data does support elements of regulatory compliance as well, where now you actually even have to disclose the breach because what was stolen was actually properly protected. Okay. But I think it's also very important for you to look at it from the responsive side of it. So as you talked about, we're going to do everything we can to put our prevention and protection mechanisms in place. We're going to detect those things when they're happening, and we're going to react and respond. Right? And so that's the other element is how do we go about and actually apply the reactive? And that's one of the things we've hooked in between this identity, the data interaction is. So as we discussed, you have the right access and authorization to get to this particular data, right? And the purpose behind doing so. The answer, let's assume, is a yes. We're going to continue to have visibility into that interaction between the human or an API as an example, to and through to the data. And if we see some sort of behavioral pattern that is off, we will be able to flag and alert that we see something. But if it's something that is so critical that you want to immediately take an action, we will automate the response to say, we're going to disconnect the user or that identity from an API into the application and have them re-authenticate back in. Or if it's to the level of that is such sensitive information that if there's something that happens operationally, we are in trouble, literally go ahead and disable the identity. Let us investigate, make decisions, and then flip it back on if it was something that we felt is actually a change we need to make in our environment to not pick that up anymore. So it's giving you flexibility in how you want to respond. It's not just telling you that there's a problem, right? And everything that we just went through.
That is, I characterize that as see something, say something, do something. And the fact that you are very upfront and simply saying we're not afraid to do something because the attacks come fast and furious, defense has to be fast and furious as well. But it's very
Sure.
difficult, right, to let the machines run defense at the speed that we need to. So it's very refreshing to hear somebody simply say, we understand that. We can do it in a way that you trust us to protect your company and that this resiliency that we talked about, first line of defense, last line of defense, evidence of defense, the specifics of what that looks like can change, but the realization that you own all three of those components to stand with me as owning the problem is very refreshing. So as we come up, my goodness, 55 minutes we've been talking about this. I do want to give you the chance. Is there anything else that I didn't bring up that you would like to communicate around the value or other pieces of the problem that maybe I didn't adequately bring forth?
I guess the only thing I would expand upon, Steve, that we didn't shockingly touch upon was AI. You didn't bring it up, I didn't bring it up, right? To me, that's actually refreshing. But I do want to bring it up because people are dealing with it, right? And they're dealing with, again, it's part of the explosion of data we discussed at the onset. And so one of the actual use cases that we're addressing right now that I want to call out specific to AI, what I'll call projects or initiatives, um, it's the same problem we've been dealing with as we talked about with people trying to do data analytics, pumping data back in, not realizing that there's sensitive data sitting in those repositories. We've got problems to deal with after the fact. Well, one of the approaches we're taking for this bigger now problem of volume of information flowing back in for LLMs to try to tap into and again derive new use cases for is much more of an approach where basically we're doing almost a sandbox, if you will. So the idea is that you stand up your LLM in a sandbox and you have your production LLM. Data obviously needs to go through your sandbox LLM first. We can go continuously scanning through, identifying if there's any sort of sensitive data. You make the decisions on what you want to do when you find that sensitive data. Pull it off, or it's going to go through in a protected mode. Kind of we talked about before how we're going to secure and format that, preserve it, let it go through its use. At that point in time, now that's kind of sanitized data model get moved into production environment. So it's a way for us to help organizations that are really trying to drive, obviously quickly, at figuring out what their use cases are to bring business benefits to them with AI, and do so in a way where the guardrails truly are being put in place to support that with this particular approach. And it's been something that is still very early, but something that people are starting to see benefits in as a way to help potentially kind of better manage what's happening in some cases that we've seen where data has been pushed out there that shouldn't have been. So it's a model again in a relatively still newer use case, but one that actually comes into play. Same principles, everything we've been talking about historically, applying it a little bit differently for this use case as well.
Well, with that, I would say we ended with AI, right?
That
So
we
we did
did.
get it in. Rob, I really want to thank you. It's been a real pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you on a topic I think that a lot of people are grappling with, but not really understanding. And so I really appreciate the clarity and the depth of experience you brought for this conversation. And so with that, thank you, Rob. It was a pleasure, and keep up the good work.
Appreciate the conversation, Steve. Great questions. And again, yeah, we have to get people thinking a little bit differently with the problems that we're dealing with now. And I appreciate you giving me the platform to do so.